Being and Caring, A Psychology for Living by Victor Daniels and Laurence J. Horowitz, as read by The Happy President. Part 2, Connecting with Others. Chapter 8, Attribution and Projection. Once I worked as a school psychologist in a community where an Aleutian family had recently arrived. The principal suggested that the boy's hair, which was cut in the traditional Eskimo style, be cut shorter. The father immediately cut off all the boy's hair. The next day, Eddie came into the classroom, put his head on his desk and his jacket over his head, and would not come out. This behavior was referred to me as a problem with the child attached to it. I made several assumptions about the boy's behavior, including castration fears associated with having his hair cut off, and anthropologists' findings that some tribes cut off the hair of a person they are excommunicating. But I got nothing back from the boy that fit any of my interpretations. Finally, I asked directly, "Eddie, why do you have a jacket over your head?" He peeked out from under his jacket and replied, "It's cold." When we gave him a knit cap to wear until his hair grew back, he was just fine. Guessing at each other's thoughts, feelings, motives, and intentions, even when many of the facts are not in, is a universal and useful process. We need to predict each other's actions, determine the sequence of events, and make sense of our experience. All this guides our own behavior. In large measure, I act toward you in ways that fit who I imagine you to be. I may not realize that my assumption or interpretation is a guess. I may conclude that it's a fact and may have a strong commitment to viewing it as such. I could infer that things are as I want them to be, or as I'm afraid they are, without knowing that I'm doing that. Or I may apply habitual ways of responding to others from my past to you in the present. Therein lies the central issue of the present chapter: how to recognize our biases in guessing each other's motives, feelings, and intentions, and how to minimize them and become more accurate. Social psychologists call this the correspondence between our attributions, our assignments of meanings, and the events in others we hope they reflect. When correspondence is high, I'm on target. When it's low, I'm not. Elements of attribution. There are, notes social psychologist Harold H. Kelly, two different contexts in which we infer what's going on in others. I may observe you just once, in only one situation, or at different times in various situations. In the first case, says Kelly, I compare your behavior to the way I'd expect others to act in the same situation and base my conclusions largely on that comparison. In the second case, where we have a history of past experience with another person to base our predictions on, Kelly suggests that we look for unique circumstances, some situation or other person, that are present when a person behaves in a certain way and absent at other times. For example, you're occasionally depressed and I worry that it's something I've done. Eventually, I begin to realize that your depression almost always occurs just after you've talked to your ex-husband. Checking out that guess with you and finding that it's right, I stop worrying that it's something I've done. There are three rules we often use in drawing conclusions about others. The first is distinctiveness. If Ellen is extremely friendly with several different people, I may conclude that she's affectionate by nature. If she's much friendlier with Derek than with others, I conclude that she feels something special for him. Distinctive actions tell us more about someone than conventional ones. There are many reasons for acting conventionally, including social and environmental pressures. But someone who acts unexpectedly is almost certain to have some personal, internal reason. When someone acts out of role, for instance, like a general taking an anti-nuclear position, we're apt to think we know more about the person and to have more confidence in our conclusions. A second rule, consensus, states that if most people would act as you did, I'm likely to conclude that the situation had a powerful influence on you. This is recognized in court, where killing in self-defense has a special status. We assume that when one's life is threatened by another, anyone might do the same. The consensus rule also suggests that I'll be more comfortable with my guesses about you if others have drawn the same conclusions, as when somebody says, "I was going to call you at home and the secretary said it would be all right." The third rule, consistency, has to do with whether you act similarly in different situations or at different times. We tend to organize our views of others so that all the elements fit together into a consistent pattern, even if accuracy suffers. In one study, 6 out of 10 people who viewed a film ignored important scenes when they wrote descriptions of the major character, in order to portray her in a more consistent way. Norman Anderson adds that people seek not just logical consistency, but also emotional consistency in their impressions of others. Apparently, we prefer not to have mixed feelings. In the service of consistency, we tend to discount other possible causes of someone's behavior once we've seized on a given cause as the likely one. Projection. I watch what you do, hear what you say, think about it, and weave all this into a guess about what's happening inside you. Then, like a film projector, I project my guess back onto you and assume that it fits your realities. This is attribution. But when my guess is so strongly shaped by my own needs and motives that it has little to do with you and a great deal to do with what's going on in me, it takes on qualities that go beyond those involved in ordinary attribution. Often, this includes attributing behavior and qualities to others that we're unwilling to perceive in ourselves, like the dishonest person who constantly suspects others of dishonesty, or the person who complains of being constantly victimized and proceeds to exploit everyone in sight. Freud called this process projection. Part of it has a magical giveaway quality. By projecting onto others something distasteful about me, I supposedly no longer have to deal with it in myself. In projection, says Pearls, we shift the boundary between ourselves and the rest of the world a little too much in our favor, in a manner that makes it possible for us to disavow or disown aspects of our personalities. He linked this process to introjection. When I've internalized some prohibition or should to please or appease another, I project the qualities that the introject forbids me to possess. It's especially important to come to terms with aggressive, hostile impulses. Otherwise, we project these impulses onto others and then try to destroy them there because they are evil. Pearls and his co-authors suggest that you can guess what another person is like and try on that way of being for yourself. Think yourself into the shoes of the aggressor, admirer, rejecter, foolhardy one, they suggest. How do you feel when you imagine yourself as that person? Do you connect with anything in yourself? Projecting our shadow sides. When I find myself intolerant of what another person does, I do well to look for ways I do the same, perhaps in a disguised or more sophisticated way. The things I'm most intolerant of in others tend to be the things I'm most intolerant of in me. Karen Horney noted that even love can be projected. Elaborating on her observations, Pearls writes, "If you are afraid to express 'I hate you,' you will soon imagine yourself being hated by the world. And likewise, if you are too shy to say 'I love you,' you will find yourself expecting love from the world." I can use my imaginings about others to find out about myself. Often what I imagine that you're thinking and feeling is what I would think and feel if I were in your place. When I project onto you what I disavow in myself and then judge you harshly for possessing that quality, I poison our relationship and hinder my own ability to grow. I find proof that what I see in you is really there by giving the smallest detail great significance. The projector is amazingly talented at elaborating, exaggerating, and dismissing contradictory evidence, and needs just one confirming instance to feel total certainty. We also project what we admire. A woman who thinks she's weak, for instance, may see people she's attracted to as strong, whether they really are or not. As I find out what I'm projecting, I get in touch with strengths within myself that I've been unaware of. Transference and displacement. Without recognizing it, sometimes we act toward a person as though he or she were someone from our past, like a former spouse, lover, or parent. When I do that with you, I see mostly the image I project on you and little of who you actually are. Freud called this process transference. I transfer my way of relating to someone else onto my relationship with you. A wife, for instance, may transfer some of her feelings toward her father onto her husband. Sexual feelings toward her husband get confused with sexual taboos involving her father, and she may experience some confusion regarding her own sexuality. Transference can play a crucial role in counseling when, as often happens, a client transfers unresolved feelings toward a parent onto the counselor and then resolves them in that situation. Subsequently, the client comes to perceive the relationship with the parent more clearly and no longer needs to confuse others with him or her. As adults, we may learn how we've misread our parents. As we discover how our projections influenced our knowing, we can appreciate our parents as people in their own right. No situation of later life is more like our childhood family than our intimate relationships, especially our connection with a mate and with children. Many of the patterns and dramas of our early years are likely to be rerun. In my present family, for example, I might throw a temper tantrum much as I did at the age of 2, something I wouldn't do with my associates at work. And in certain ways, I expect my mate to care for me as my parents cared for me, evoking memories of comforting from long ago. A certain amount of this feels all right to me, but if my internal experience of you, influenced by my adult experience as well as my recollection of childhood, is so strong that I can't see through it to contact you as you are, we're in for trouble. Then I'm likely to distort what I hear you say so that it sounds like what I expect you to say, even when that's not what you're saying, without realizing that I'm doing this. To the extent that I do this, I live in a world of imaginary people whose motives and intentions, feelings, and messages I've changed in my mind to fit my historical expectations. When I overtly act toward you in ways that were meant for someone else, it's called displacement. Displacement of aggression is especially common. I can't beat up father, but I can beat up little brother. I'm afraid to talk back to my boss, but I can be nasty to my mate. I do cruel things to you that are really meant for the big kids who used to torment me when I was small. Transference and displacement are often linked. Self-consciousness and projection. When we feel self-conscious, suggests Pearls, we act as if we have no eyes. I'm so anxious about what you think of me that I see almost nothing about you. I've projected my eyes onto you, and from there I look back at myself, criticizing and belittling what I see. We can also act as if we have no ears, not hearing ourselves but worrying about how others hear us. In Pearl's words, people expect the ears to be outside and they talk and expect someone to listen. But who listens? When I'm caught up in my own mind, I have little attention left to perceive what's outside me. Embarrassed about not knowing what's going on, I pretend. Then I become self-conscious because I'm faking my way through and I'm afraid someone might find me out. Fortunately, this process is reversible. The more energy I put into observing what's going on, the less energy I divert into covering up. I can tell I'm coming out of one of the whirlpools in my mind when I begin to see and hear again. Next time you walk into a room and feel self-conscious, stop, take a deep, slow breath, and feel your breathing and your whole body. Then really look at and listen to the other people there, learning all you can about them. As you do, your self-consciousness is likely to diminish. Next time you start to worry about what someone else is thinking of you, Stop and consider how much you've been observing that person. Have you been watching him or her closely? Probably not. You've been largely involved in your own concerns. The same is likely to be true of others around you. Each person is too busy wondering how he or she is coming across to have much time to pay attention to you. Projection and unmet needs. Projections can grow out of unmet or unresolved needs for acceptance, affection, power, or other qualities. Remember those stencils you can trace letters or spray paint through? If I hold one up and look through it, I see only what's visible through the cutout letters. Bozormeni-Nagy in 1965 suggests that due to unmet needs, sometimes we act as if we're carrying around such a stencil, tacking it into anyone we meet who's even vaguely appropriate. We perceive only what's visible through it. If I view others through a paranoid stencil, for instance, I tend to experience them as critical, punitive, dangerous, or out to get me. Projection is often involved when a person feels rejected, unaware that I'm rejecting others, whether by keeping my distance, by pushing others away with put-downs and hostility, by talking about only surface trivia, or in yet other ways. I imagine that others are rejecting me. I may need contact and affection, but I'm afraid people would turn away if I reached out, smother me if they did respond, or hurt me even more deeply if I were to open up to some connection. But since I convince myself that the other person has rejected me, I don't need to deal with any of those issues. If you think others don't want to be with you, be attentive to how you withdraw and keep others away. The projection process, notes Bozormeni-Nagy, is strongest in people who are doing a poor job of taking care of their own and each other's emotional needs. In an ongoing relationship, if my reality is not so nourishing, I may imagine you taking care of me as I was or wanted to be taken care of in the past. I still mourn the loss of idealizing mothering and fathering figures of my childhood and fantasize that you can provide for me as I remember them doing, instead of working out mutually supportive behavior with the real you. People sometimes expect a child to meet emotional needs that the spouse isn't meeting. To keep the parent's love and approval, the child may try to meet the parent's wish. Melody, for instance, was divorced the year after her younger daughter was born. Overindulged as a child, Melody treated her own children as little adults who could not only take care of her emotional needs, but some of her physical needs too. Her oldest daughter, Heather, became the one who washed the dishes, kept the house clean, made lunch for everyone. Theodore Lidz in 1963 calls this crossing the generation boundaries. Melody switched generational roles with her daughters. Now at 18, Heather reflects sadly, "I never had a chance to be a little kid. I was busy being responsible and taking care of mom." In some ways, she was still stuck emotionally at the child's level, just like Melody. Another side of this issue is resenting you for neglecting my needs, now just as they were neglected in the past. Whether or not you're really neglecting me now. Sometimes this is explicit. "You're just like my father. How do I deserve not just one good-for-nothing male in one lifetime, but two?" Sometimes repressed hate and wishes for revenge toward a parent are displaced onto a spouse or child with violent and tragic consequences, as in child abuse. If you and I behave as described here, our relationship is in large measure a shadow play of mutual projections, as we each serve as a stimulus to the other for replaying our old tapes. When we start to work at making present-day contact aimed at finding ways to meet our emotional needs in the present, we begin to be genuine companions for each other who can offer accommodation, acceptance, richness, and depth. How our attributions go astray. We can easily get stuck on assumptions that are distortions. "I know what you mean. Don't try to tell me you didn't mean that. You knew very well what I wanted." If I hold to my mistaken assumption despite your protests, we're headed for trouble. Among the things that can contribute to the distortions we sometimes cling to so tenaciously are these. 1. Strong emotional needs that are not necessarily in line with other people's realities. When our insecurities are strong enough, our attributions tend to be in directions that support or assuage them. Strong investment in our hopes or fears can also bias our inferences. 2. Mind reading while neglecting to check out our conclusions. People like to play mind reader, especially amateur psychologists. Reading meanings into what others say, we act on the basis of our interpretations. When our expectations are not fulfilled, we may identify those persons as being resistant, avoidant, or fixated. This is a good way to drive each other crazy. Just as I may imagine that I'm unerring as a guess what's happening in you, I may expect you to be omniscient in your guesses about me, and take it as evidence of indifference if you're not. You should have known. You must not care for me very much if you didn't know that. But you never told me. That doesn't matter. I shouldn't have to tell you a thing like that. You should just understand. You keep on refusing to tell me explicitly what you're thinking and feeling, and at the same time you feel hurt and angry because I don't understand how you feel or what you want. In fact, I can love you but not be able to read your subtle signals. If we both recognize that, you don't build up resentment about my misreading you, and I don't build up resentment about your not telling me what you're dealing with. When I want to know, I ask. When you want me to know what you're experiencing, you tell me, and vice versa. 3. Preconceptions and expectations. These can lead us to ignore or distort the evidence of our experience. In a dramatic experience, Kelly in 1950 gave students written descriptions of a person who was scheduled to present a guest lecture. The descriptions were identical except for one word. The speaker was characterized in some as warm and in others as cold. Then the guest lecturer came in and led a class discussion. Afterwards, those told he was warm were much more approving than those told he was cold, even though all had listened to the same person lead the same discussion. 4. The false consensus bias leads us to assume that most other people think, feel, and act pretty much as we do, and that those who behave differently are deviant. A parent who batters his or her child, for instance, is more likely than others to believe that such abuse is common, and students who agreed to wear a large "Eat at Joe's" sign around their college campus for 30 minutes were twice as likely to think most other students would agree to do the same as were students who refused. That's why the deltas of the movie Animal House got into such trouble. Wouldn't everybody want to have a toga party? 5. The self is positive, other is negative bias. To maintain our self-images and justify our actions, we tend to take credit for positive actions by us and others, but to hold others responsible for negative ones. Finger-pointing becomes an act of self-purification. 6. Impression management by the other person. You may be playing a role and trying to lead me to believe it reflects who you are at a deeper level, when in fact it doesn't, and you aren't. 7. Lack of crucial information. I simply may not have the data I need to accurately infer how you're responding. My confusion may be a guide to my need for information, yet interfere with my information gathering. 8. The availability bias. The information most readily available about someone may influence us most, whether or not it's the most important or most accurate. Primacy and recency effects are relevant here. What I learned about you first and/or what I've found out most recently may affect my impressions more than the knowledge I've gathered in between. 9. Distancing language. This is a way I distort my attributions about myself, a way I project, and thereby disown my power and responsibility. Fran, for example, says, and then you notice that the years are going by and you have a hard time being in meaningful contact with other people, and it's just like you're in a bad dream. Substituting I for you changes the personal relevance of the statement. Fran really meant, I notice, I have a hard time. It's like I'm in a bad dream. She was out of touch with herself as the doer of what she did. One is usually also the projective form. One thinks that, protects me from my responsibility for I think that, and so on. And there's also some people say, and everybody knows that, we can likewise disown thoughts and feelings by using the word it, or an equivalent. My temper possesses me. My temper is an it. Instead, I can use I language to reaffirm, at least in speech, my projected power and responsibility. So instead of, a compulsion to scream enters my mind, I say, I feel like screaming. Instead of, a wall separates me from other people, I say, I push people away. High interest inference checking. Accurate attributions are derived from what we see, sense, and hear. People who are mistaken are usually those who close themselves to changing their ideas when new information comes along. Suppose I meet someone I'd like to talk with, but she seems distant. If I assume it's because she didn't like me, I may be right or wrong. Perhaps her car just died, and that's why she's distracted. By asking if something is bothering her, I'm less likely to misinterpret her response. To check out an attribution directly, I ask you if what I'm assuming is so. I might say something like, I think I'm hearing you say. Since I'm stating my inference out loud in a clear, accepting way, you may be less hesitant about responding. If my guess is wrong, clarify as you wish. Of course, such an exchange will be effective only if I seem responsive and available. If I sound intolerant or accusatory, if you're smart, you'll stay closed. Even in a long-standing relationship, at almost any point I can start asking what's happening with you, even though I haven't been asking up until now. There's almost always room for a new beginning. The way I ask can be very important. In a marriage counseling session, the husband became irate when his wife asked, "Where are you now?" He thought she was probing and poking, attacking him and implying, "You're being secretive." "Is that how you feel?" I asked her. "No," she replied. She began to look for a statement about herself that would reach her husband and came up with, "I need to hear you now." He replied, "That feels good. I can respond to that and not feel probed at." The same principle is equally important for parent and child, teacher and student. Sometimes a person maintains that his or her feelings, actions, and intentions are different than I've concluded that they are. My experience is that there is no value in trying to convince you that your inner events are as I say they are. Some people ask, won't checking out my attributions interfere with using my intuition? No. Learning to distinguish between your actual sensory data and your inferences lets you avoid confusing your observations with your imaginings and helps you check out inferences based on your data rather than assuming that the inferences are the data. The better I get at checking out my attributions, the more I can rely on my intuitive intelligence. My intuition is most trustworthy when I'm tuned into all the cues that might give me information. Intuition includes both being sensitive to all the data another person provides and being adept at piecing it together into a multi-dimensional picture by drawing on faculties that are deeper and more mysterious than my conscious intelligence alone. I want to use my intuition when it serves me well and not enshrine it when I'm off the mark. Another useful insight lies in Zajong's 1960 contrast between transmission tuning, in which I expect to have to transmit my impression of someone to others, and reception tuning, in which I expect to receive more information about the person. Cohen in 1964 found that people who were told to be ready to describe their impressions to others were more likely to form a consistent impression and ignore information that contradicted it. People instructed to be ready for more information were more receptive to data that didn't fit the impression they'd already formed. Apparently, when we're not under pressure to draw quick inferences, we're better off to withhold judgment and adopt an attitude of wanting to learn more. End of Chapter 8.